everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Requirements Reuse, Fantasy or Feasible. Today's featured speaker is Karl E. Wiegers, the Principal Consultant at Process Impact. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions features of the GoToWebinar software. And now, I'd like to introduce Karl. Karl, please take it away.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. If you get excited about requirements reuse, and I hope you will, then a good place to learn more would be Chapter 18 of this book, Software Requirements 3rd Edition, which I co-authored with Beatty a few years ago. And this has got really the most information I've seen in one place on this topic. There's not a huge amount written on requirements reuse, which is kind of unfortunate because it seems like a good way that people can explore to improve their productivity. So this is a place that you can learn more, Chapter 18. So here's a little bit of information about me, some contact information and the like. You might check out the downloadable process goodies that I've got listed there at the bottom at my website, processimpact.com. There's a bunch of templates and other useful items available there. And the slide shows some of the books that I've written. The one on the right was kind of interesting. It's called Pearls from Sand. It's a memoir of life lessons I wrote a few years ago. It was fun to write something completely different from my software books. And in fact, I've just finished writing my first novel titled The Reconstruction, which was even more fun to write. I've never had so much good times writing anything. And it's not published yet, but I hope it will be soon. So look for The Reconstruction one of these days if you want to read something totally different. So let's dive in here. Reuse is an eternal goal for people who are looking for increased software productivity. People think often in terms of code reuse, but a lot of other software project components also have reuse potential, like requirements, for example. So fundamentally, reuse means taking advantage of work that has been done previously, whether on the same project or on some earlier project. And anytime you can avoid starting from scratch, you've got a running start on your project. But systematic requirements reuse does not seem to be practiced very widely, at least according to one survey done fairly recently that I saw. So this presentation is going to try to give you some ideas of how we can approach reusing requirements so you can think about whether that might be an avenue that your organization wants to pursue for increasing its productivity. I'm going to describe several dimensions of requirements reuse, ways to think about it and ways to approach it, point out some of the sorts of information that have good reuse potential in various contexts, and several common reuse scenarios, and you can again try to map that into your world and see if one or another of those might be suitable for your projects. I'll give you a few tips about making requirements reusable. I mean, sure, anything lying around the house we could potentially use again, but if you are working for toward the goal of having some repository of reusable requirements that you can apply over and over on multiple projects, there are some things to keep in mind to help that be more effective than just grabbing something that's already out there and hoping it works. But then we'll have to think about the practicalities here. I'm going to point out some of the barriers that can make it difficult to reuse requirements effectively, and also some of the success factors that can help you make this work for you. And ultimately then wrap things up with some tips about how to get started with requirements reuse in your environment. Well, why do we care about this at all? And the motivations for reusing requirements information should be obvious, but let's take a look at some of them here. First of all, reusing requirements can increase the productivity of everyone on the team, including the business analysts, developers, testers. Everybody else who's affected by the project can get higher productivity if we don't have to invent as much stuff starting all over. Now, if you've got higher productivity, that can lead to faster solution delivery and also reduced development costs. And I think everybody would find those attractive. Now, from the user's perspective, requirements reuse can improve the functional consistency either across related members of some product line or among a set of business applications. And I'll bet you've actually encountered this in a kind of frustrating way in some of your own experience. Think about, for example, the ability to format blocks of text by applying the same styling, spacing, maybe angling the text on the page, and certain other properties. Think of how you do that in all the various Microsoft Office applications. I find it really annoying when I can do certain kinds of that formatting in certain ways, say in PowerPoint, but I can't do it the same way, or maybe even do it at all in Word. So that to me is very annoying when you have to figure out, how do I do what I'm trying to do here that I could do there in something it seems like you should be able to do both. So that kind of thing drives me nuts. And so the functional consistency helps reduce the learning curve for people, so you're not trying to keep in your mind multiple ways to do the same thing. And it leads to less frustration when you end up wasting time trying to do something that just doesn't work or isn't doable at all. So if you can make this kind of functionality work in a uniform fashion, that actually involves reusing both functional requirements and usability requirements. So that saves time also during requirements development when you don't need to specify similar requirements repeatedly for a family of products or across a product line. There's a quality aspect here too. If you can reuse existing high quality requirements, that leads to fewer defects in the product. So many of the defects and errors that we run into with software products are because of errors in the requirements. And that translates then into errors in design or poorly chosen design solutions. And if we can reuse something that we know works, a lot of those problems goes away. And this leads to reduced rework that has to be performed to fix the system or to respond to customer complaints. So there's a lot of benefits here to requirements reuse. So we can think of 3 dimensions of requirements reuse here that I want to share with you. The first dimension is the extent of the assets that are being reused, and we'll go into each of these in detail here. The second dimension is how much modification do you have to perform to allow some existing piece of knowledge to be reused in its new setting. And the third dimension is the mechanism that you're using to actually reuse some chunks of information. And as we'll see on the next few slides, there are several possibilities within each of these various dimensions. So when you're contemplating reusing some requirements information, think about which of the options in each of these 3 dimensions would be most appropriate and most practical for meeting your objectives. So let's take a look at these in turn. First, the extent of reuse. That's what the first dimension has to do, the quantity of material that you're reusing. And we can start on a very simple level and say you might just reuse a single functional requirement. Maybe you're specifying a related product family member or the next version of some software, or maybe you're specifying requirements for a system that's going to replace some existing legacy system. And you might say, hey, there's a bit of functionality from the old specification. We need that here too. So you just reuse a single functional requirement. But maybe we can do better than that. You might reuse a requirement statement along with any associated attributes. Attributes are pieces of information that go beyond just the statement of the intended functional behavior and tell you more about something such as the rationale behind that requirement, the origin, where did that requirement come from, its priority, maybe how you intend to validate or verify the requirement. So requirement attributes give you a richer description of each piece of requirements knowledge than the simple requirement statement alone does. Now in some cases you can reuse not just the requirement and its attributes, but also some associated artifacts that have to do with the context of the requirement, maybe data definitions that are associated with some bit of functionality. Maybe you've got some acceptance tests that you've written and you can carry those along as well. You might be aware of relevant business rules that pertain to certain requirements and all this kind of stuff. So you have a little package of information, not just a requirement, but some of this associated knowledge that goes with that. Now often you can reuse a whole set of related requirements, such as all the functional requirements that are associated with a particular feature. We'll talk more about reusing sets of information like this a little bit later. Now if you have applications that run on similar platforms, like maybe different smartphone operating systems, you could perhaps reuse requirements and design elements. So maybe you're going to implement an app in iOS, and other operating systems, you're going to implement it the same way visually, say, so the design is similar, both in the internal design and maybe the visual design that the user experiences. But maybe you can't reuse the code that goes with that just because there are specifics in the operating system that we have to be able to respect and customize. Now, the ultimate ideal scenario lets you reuse a whole package of requirements, associated analysis, visual models, design components, code and tests, maybe even documentation, help screens, those sorts of things. In other words, you reuse an entire chunk of implemented functionality essentially unchanged from a related product or previous system. This is sometimes called drag-along requirements reuse because you're dragging the downstream work products along with the requirement itself into another project. Now, the farther up we go on this scale, the more benefits you're getting from the reuse because you've got more information you're able to reuse, not just saying, hey, make the new system do this thing that the old system did too. So look for the scope here, the extent of reuse that you might be able to get away with in each situation so that you can maximize the leverage from the investment your organization has already made in doing all this kind of work once before. So let me show you an example here. Here's an example of how you might be able to reuse requirements across projects even if the implementation specifics vary from one environment to another. So suppose you need to fly somewhere. So you might want to do some of these kinds of functions. Print boarding passes, change your seats, maybe request an upgrade or actually buy an upgrade. Maybe you have to pay for checked luggage and do all the other things that allow airlines to squeeze money out of you. Now, there are several ways that might work. The airline probably has a website that lets you do all of these kinds of things, but they may also have self-service check-in kiosks at airports where you can perform the same actions. And if all else fails, you may be actually lucky enough to talk to a human being, an airline counter agent, to perform whichever of those operations you need to. Now, obviously, the implementation is going to be different whether you're doing it on a website, doing it on a kiosk that probably has a touch screen and has to be very simple for people who don't use it very often, versus talking to someone who's using her own system behind the counter to perform these operations for you. So the functionality of all these operations will be nearly identical and therefore reusable across the three systems, even though the implementations and the user experiences are different. So for example, if you buy a seat upgrade online on your website, you'll probably type in your credit card number, or maybe it's stored in your profile. But if you decide to buy a seat upgrade at the kiosk, you're probably going to have to run your credit card through the card reader. So this is a good example of reuse of requirements, even if the implementation isn't going to be completely reused. So you wouldn't be able to do what I just described as drag-along reuse for something like this, because the designs are going to be different and the implementations will be different. But definitely you can get a great deal of reuse starting from the requirements and then moving on up from there. So that's the first example of reuse dimensions, is the quantity of material being reused. Now let's look at the second dimension, and that's to think about how much modification you're going to have to do to make the existing requirements reusable on the new project. Now, in some cases, you don't have to do anything different. You'll be able to reuse the requirement unchanged. And this is probably the case regarding the airline's check-in kiosk and website. Probably those requirements would be just the same, but the details of how you go on for the implementation would, of course, be different. Now, in other cases, maybe you can reuse the requirement statement unchanged, but you might have to modify some of its attributes, like its priority. Maybe in one application, the particular requirement has high priority, but it's medium priority in a different application for whatever your business objectives are. Maybe you have a different rationale or origin, or you're going to test it in some different way. So think about which attributes would be reusable unchanged, which ones you might have to modify for the new context. Now, a lot of the times, you're going to start with an existing requirement, but you have to modify it a little bit to exactly suit the new purpose. and that's fine. You don't have to invent it all. You're starting with the fact that there's some knowledge that you already have, but you can modify it a little bit to suit the new context. Finally, whether or not you have to change the requirement, you still might have to modify some of the tests, the designs, and so forth. An example of this might be if you're porting some functionality, say from a PC to a tablet that has a touch screen rather than a mouse and keyboard interface. So the designs and tests will change even if the functionality does not. So think about how much modification you're going to have to perform if you are going to be reusing certain requirements. And then the third dimension deals with the reuse mechanism. Now, the simplest form of requirements reuse is a copy and paste from another specification. You say, hey, I've got it over here and I need it. Let me just paste it into the specification for whatever we're doing next. Or you might have accumulated a library of reusable requirements. So just copying and pasting it from there would be the easiest way to do it. Now, if you do this, you're not retaining a history of where the original information came from, and you can modify the copies you make. Okay, so this is good, but it has some risks as well. Copy and paste increases the size of your specification because you're duplicating information. And there's also a real risk you have to be alert to, and that's the risk that someone modifies maybe one instance of a reused requirement. But if that requirement then shows up multiple places in the target application, they may not modify it accordingly everywhere. And this is a fundamental problem anytime you are duplicating information that shows up in multiple places in your project. There's a good chance that if some of those instances get changed, that you might overlook others, and that leads to generating inconsistencies, which can lead to all sorts of bad things later on. But copy and paste is simple, and often simple is good. Usually, though, you're better off if you can reuse existing content by pointing to it, referring to it, rather than replicating it. And this means the original source of the information has to be accessible to anyone who needs to view that requirement, and it must be persistent. You know, if you're just going to point to something and say, yeah, what it said over there, we're going to do that again. Well, if that changes, then anything that's on the other end of that pointer that's pointing to it also is going to be changed, and that might not be a good thing. That's why it has to be persistent. So one way to do this is if you're storing your requirements in a document and you want the same requirement to appear in multiple places or across from one document to another, you can use a cross-referencing feature in your word processor to link copies of it back to the master instance. And I did this a lot in a set of documents I created for one of my consulting clients once, where there were extensive cross-references from one document to another, and we could use hyperlinks built into Word to establish those connection points. So you can use the cross-reference function as a way to mirror things, or you can use hyperlinks to cross over from one document to another. Now, if you're using the cross-reference feature, say in Microsoft Word, then what you're doing is basically just putting in a pointer back to the original instance wherever else you want that to be copied. And if you ever change that master instance, that change is echoed everywhere you inserted the cross-reference link. So this avoids the inconsistency that can arise when you do a simple copy and paste and change one of those but maybe not others. But it does run that risk of all the requirements changing if someone alters the master instance. So if you wanted to change a requirement, you probably don't want to just point back to the original. You do want to do copy and paste so you can modify it. But if you want to use something unchanged, then you can do the cross-reference. That make sense? All right. So another possibility as a copy by reference is to not store the original requirement, but just a pointer to it. And this works great if you have sets of reusable information. For example, a kind of knowledge that I think is very valuable for any project to record is information about the user classes, the different communities of people who might be using the system in various ways. So what you might actually choose to do is to collect your descriptions of your various user classes in some pile, okay, in a shared location, and give each one of those user class descriptions in the collection a unique identifier. And that way you can incorporate that information by reference. So you would put in the identifier for the reused item in the new project's documentation and not just copy the whole block of text. So I find this is really helpful when there are things like definitions, glossary terms, data objects, things like that that you're going to reuse. You can collect somewhere, point to them, rather than actually pasting the text back in. And so someone who wants to view that user class description, say, to which you've pointed, just follows the link to go back to the master source, and all the information they need is there. One advantage of this kind of approach is that it cuts down the volume of your requirements document. Let's say you're writing a specification and maybe you have 6 user classes. Maybe 5 of those are user classes that you've dealt with before on other projects, and so you've got this catalog of user class descriptions. So you can just point to those 5 and say, hey, over here, if you want to read about the user classes, here's user class 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Just follow the link and learn what you need to know. And then if you have something that's specific to that new project, maybe a 6th different user class, then you would want to put that description, right in the context of the documentation for that project. So the problem here is there's no perfect solution. If you put everything together through copy and paste, then you get a more voluminous pile of requirements knowledge. Not everybody likes that. But if you use pointers, then you have to follow the pointer to get to the other end to get the information you need. There's just no perfect solution to it. So think about which mechanism would be most appropriate in your environment to enable you to reuse existing information with as little work as possible, but also to safely start with something and then change it when you need to. I think all we can do here in this brief webinar is touch on some of these ideas, fairly quickly and make you aware of the options. And I would encourage you to go look at Chapter 18 of my Software Requirements book if it's something you want to look at more carefully and think about just how you might apply it. So let's think about how you might use tools to help you do this. That's really what you have to do if you want to get serious about requirements reuse. You're not going to be able to do this on a large scale or for a bunch of projects manually with traditional documents. A much more effective way to reuse by reference is to store the information in a requirements management tool. Now, exactly how that will work depends on the tool's capabilities. But for example, you might be able to reuse a requirement that's already in the database without having to replicate it. Some requirements management tools retain historical versions of individual requirements, and that would let you reuse a specific version of a requirement. So if someone modifies that requirement in the tool, the older version that you're using in your project still exists. And then you can modify that to suit the needs of your project without disrupting other people who are also pointing back to that same thing. Let me show you how that might work. Let's say we've got 3 projects here, project A, B, and C. So our first project is project A in the middle there. So project A creates the initial version of a particular requirement, okay? So time goes from left to right across the scale. So project A starts the ball rolling by saying, I'm going to create version 1 of some requirement. Now later on, project B says, hey, we want to reuse that same requirement. So if you're using a requirements management tool with a database in it, then you can just point back to that and say, hey, I want to reuse version 1 of that same requirement that came from project A. Again, this is going to depend on what capabilities any particular requirements management tool will provide. I don't try to stay on top of that. I know someone's going to ask, well, can you tell me a good tool that will do this? And I cannot, because I don't try to stay on top of the 40 or so requirements management tools and all of their evolving capabilities. But this would be a very simple kind of reuse. There's one version of the requirement, and project B says, I would like that also, please. But maybe as time goes on, project A decides to modify its copy of that requirement. So they create a new version, version 2. But in the tool, if it's storing historical versions, both version 1 and version 2 are still there. So project B is not hurt by the fact that project A decided to modify that particular requirement. And this can go on, as much as we need to. Maybe project B says, all right, I want to modify that requirement 2 that we started with, and now that becomes version 3 that could still be stored in there. And maybe project C comes along and they say, oh, we would like to use that same requirement, but we want the current version from A, which is what I've called version 2 here. And this can go as long as you want. Maybe they modify it, now it becomes version 4, and project A changes it again, that becomes version 5. So long as we've got these stored in a tool such that it's maintaining these version histories, and I can point from one project to a specific version of that particular requirement, then there's no problem. Okay? This is the most powerful and flexible reuse mechanism, but not every tool will probably fully support this. So if you're using a requirements management tool, you might look into its capabilities to see if it's going to let you do this kind of thing. Let's think about the kinds of requirements information that are more amenable to reuse than maybe other kinds of information. Here are several classes of information that have good reuse potential across the various projects that some enterprise is going to undertake. A lot of times you're creating projects or systems and applications that have some relevance in a particular business domain, like let's say banking or something, and there are terms that are going to be used across those applications, and we want those terms to be used consistently. I'm a big fan of creating a project glossary in which you store those terms to make sure that everyone who's working on the project, all the stakeholders, have the same understanding of what each of those terms means. So a glossary has great reuse potential. You certainly don't need to create a unique glossary for every project that are related in some vertical business. Have a shared glossary so that everybody can get those same definitions. Stakeholder profiles, if you have, and not everybody creates these, but I think it's a really good idea. If you're doing stakeholder analysis early in your project, and thinking about all the various people and organizations who either could be influenced by your project or who could be or could have an impact on the project themselves, you might want to have some descriptions of those various stakeholders to help us understand what's important to them, who they are, which ones are more important to the business success, and so forth. Again, that's likely to be reused across multiple projects, and no need to duplicate all of that information from one to another. I just gave you the example of user class descriptions. Users are a subset of stakeholders. Users and stakeholders are not the same thing. Some stakeholders are users, but not all. And so if you have descriptions of members of particular user classes, which I think is a really good idea, that's potentially reusable. Now, a lot of people create what are called user personas, and that's where you say, okay, we've got this description of a class of similar users with similar needs. Well, let's try to come up with a description of an imaginary person who would be a representative of that user class, and this is called a persona. So if you've got those kinds of personas where you've put some effort into describing what this individual might be like, that's going to be your stand-in representative for a particular class of users. Again, if you have the same kinds of users from project to project, let's reuse the user personas. There's no need to start all over on every project with that. Business rules very often affect many, many projects in your organization. Business rules are things like corporate policies or government regulations or computational formulas, industry standards, things like that that could affect a lot of applications in a particular business domain. So let's not copy all those business rules from one project to another. Let's collect them someplace. Let's point to them, and that way if the rule changes, then we can make sure that every place that points back to it can get back to the original or to the current version of that rule instead of having to update it everywhere we've copied it into. A really good example of a reusable asset is around security requirements. There's absolutely no reason for every project team in an organization to reinvent requirements for things like user logon, authentication, the processes for, and the rules for changing and resetting passwords, handling user privilege levels, all that kind of stuff. Reuse security requirements also help provide a more consistent user experience. I have, and I'll bet you have also, used websites that have, maybe you need multiple logins for certain services that the website provides, like for, a credit card company or something. And they might have different password rules. They might have different rules about how often you have to change your password, or what characters are allowed in a password, or the minimum and maximum number of characters in a password. Those kinds of things just drive me nuts, because there's no reason for those inconsistencies. If we think in terms of reuse, then we can make the user's experience much more satisfactory. And it's not that much harder to do this. Let me give you a little kind of isolated example. Just a few days ago, I was in Boise, Idaho. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I drove over to Boise, Idaho to visit my mother. My mother's 90 years old, and she needed online access for her bank. Doesn't matter why, but we set that up. And one of the things it asked for, like many websites do now, is security questions. So they had a list of maybe 20 possible security questions I could choose from, and they were pretty good questions. So I had to set up 2 security questions, and I chose one from the list, and then it said, okay, choose another security question, and the one I had just chosen was still in the list of options. Well, it probably would have complained if I had chosen that same question again and had just, 2 security questions that were exactly the same thing. That's stupid. But wouldn't it be a better choice to change the list of possible security questions so that I couldn't possibly choose the same one again? That's just not very hard to do. That, to me, is the difference between quality software and crap. And I don't have much patience with that. Well, if you're reusing things like security requirements, then what you can do is put effort into creating a very good comprehensive set of requirements for things like security questions and passwords and all that stuff, and reuse it across all your applications so people don't have to do it in different ways from one project to the next. They don't have to do it well on one project and not very well on another project. We get the best of what we know how to do, and you can reuse that so everybody's project comes out better. I think this is a good thing. Another example of reusable requirements is around accessibility requirements. There are government regulations that stipulate what kinds of capabilities applications have to provide in order to be used by people with certain restrictions or disabilities. And so accessibility requirements are eminently reusable. Any of those kinds of things can save us time. So think about what kind of information in your environment has good potential for reuse across projects. See, this is the sort of thing you would reuse more across a project instead of within a certain project. But look for ways to do that. So here's some other examples, classes of requirements information that have good reuse potential across various scopes of applicability. For example, within a product or application, you might be able to reuse certain user requirements, like maybe user stories or bits of use cases. Certain chunks of functionality might be usable in different parts of the application. Performance requirements, usability, a lot of those non-functional classes of requirements might apply multiple places within the same application. Now, across a product line, so by a product line here, I mean, for example, think about income tax preparation software. You might have a trial version, a pro version, an enterprise version, a business versus individuals, and so forth. So across a product line of related products in a family, you might have reusable business objectives, maybe business process models, visual models like context diagrams. If you're in a regulated industry, you might have certain compliance requirements that apply to all of those products or some of them. Data models, data definitions certainly will reappear across multiple products. And see some of the other kinds of capabilities, core features that have to be present in all of those products and so forth. Now across a business domain, whatever business you happen to be working in, you might again have business process models and user requirements, things users need to be able to do with the product to get important work done. Acceptance tests often can be usable across a business domain, security requirements, as we just talked about. Now, within a particular operating system or platform, you might have some constraints, technical constraints that have to be respected. Like, for example, you might be able to reuse things in smartphone apps so that you're aware of things like screen size, resolution, and user interaction constraints like the recognized swiping gestures. How many fingers can I use at once on this particular touch screen? Those kind of constraints and interfaces often would be reusable either within an operating system or a hardware platform. So let's think about reusing these various sets of requirements information. That offers more reuse value than do single isolated requirements. So as I gave you some of these examples earlier, like functionality plus exceptions and acceptance tests. That's a really nice set of things that could go together as a little package of reuse beyond just a fragment of functionality. Business rules particularly related to compliance, like Sarbanes-Oxley rules, regulatory constraints that pertain to a particular industry. You might have organizational policies that are directives that affect multiple applications as a set. A lot of times there's symmetrical functions. Someone builds an undo function in. Well, you might like a redo also. So let's look for symmetrical packages of capabilities that would go together very logically like that. Data objects, and not just the data objects themselves, but the attributes for them and the validations that you could perform on entered data, eminently reusable. Related operations that you might perform on certain objects. So there's this acronym you might have heard of called CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. Very common operations that are performed on data objects. And so if you've got some functionality that leads to creating a certain data object, think about, do we also have some related functionality that would be for these other functions, read, update, delete, maybe change, all those sorts of things. So look for packages, because if you can write a set of comprehensive, well-specified requirements for these little sets of common capabilities, they can be reused many times. That'll save time, that'll provide consistency across applications, and it'll improve the user experience as well. So keep the users in mind when you're doing these things. Here's a couple of common scenarios where requirements reuse can accelerate your project. The software product line is a place where you can have a lot of functionality in common. Maybe you're creating variations of a particular base product for certain customers or certain markets. And maybe requirements you incorporate into one variant for a particular customer that might eventually be folded into a common specification for the base product. So look for the features in the product line to see which ones are common to multiple members of the family, which ones are optional, which means they might appear in certain family members but not others. So you might have certain functionality that appears in a pro version but not an amateur version or a student version or something. There might be variants, so it's done one way in this application, but if you buy the enterprise version, then it's got more capabilities available for the user. So look for things that have different versions of the feature appearing in different family members. In fact, this is a place where you might get the full drag-along reuse opportunity I described earlier. And I go back again to this income tax preparation package. I know of a income tax preparation program that offers a free version for online use. It's got basic, deluxe, premier, home and business versions, all for use on PCs. Now they're going to have a lot of things in common. The ways you calculate taxes, the rules for that are going to be the same for all of these, but they're also going to have differences in terms of what they let the user do. So the common features are the ones that give you the greatest opportunity for reusing not just certain requirements, but also the drag-along stuff, the downstream work products like architectural components, design elements, code, and tests. So this drag-along reuse is the most powerful form, but the opportunity doesn't come up that often. Now, another place where you certainly find good reuse opportunities is with re-engineering or replacement systems. Now, these always reuse some requirements from the original incarnation that you're starting with, even if those requirements were never written down. So you might have to look at the existing system that you're replacing or rebuilding. You might have to go look at that and see what information about the current requirements can I harvest from that. You have to reverse engineer the requirements. Little safety tip. Probably you've had to do this on some project. If you do, write down what you've learned. A lot of people don't do that. They do some reverse engineering to get knowledge out of some existing system, but they don't write it down, and then that means you get to do it again in another year because nobody ever wrote it down. I have a philosophy that the cost of recording knowledge is small compared to the cost of acquiring knowledge. So if you have to go study some application and figure out, what's some chunk of requirements and functionality around it, that probably cost you more effort than writing down whatever you learn. So I think it's a small price to pay to record it. This is also another place where you might have business rules, sometimes obvious, sometimes buried in the code, that you have to incorporate and address in the replacement system. So here's a picture that kind of illustrates this re-engineering or replacement operation. Maybe you're starting with some existing system. We're going to come up with a replacement system. There might be certain features or capabilities in the existing system you're going to get rid of. So we'll drop those. There might be certain features you're adding to the new system that weren't in the original, so we're going to put those in. There's probably going to be some changes that you'll make, and there's going to be certain features that you need to replicate from the existing system to the new system. And that's really where the reuse comes in, is the features that you're going to replicate from the old environment to the new. Well, let's think about what you might want to do to help make your requirements be reusable so that this can give you the maximum benefits. First, of course, write them down. If you don't document the requirements, then your chances for reusing them effectively go down dramatically, no matter how good the requirements are. Now, I want to point out that there are two techniques I do not recommend in use on software projects when you're working on requirements. Those are telepathy and clairvoyance. I don't think those are very effective techniques, even though they seem to be the technical foundation for many projects. Instead, I kind of like writing down information in a way that we can share it with other people. Now, just because a requirement exists doesn't mean it's reusable in its present form. It could be specific to a particular product. Maybe it's written at too high of a level, not much detail, because the BA could safely assume certain knowledge on the part of the development team. Or maybe because some details were communicated only verbally. On an Agile project, this is a significant risk, because if there's not much information in there recorded, then the reuse potential goes down. So what we have to do maybe is tune up the original requirements to increase their value to future BAs. So to make requirements reusable, we need high quality requirements. Now, fortunately, the steps that you take that make requirements more reusable also increases their value to the original project that you wrote them for. It simply makes them better requirements. Now, one way to do this is to write requirements according to a pattern. And there's a guy named Stephen Withall who wrote a book that I strongly encourage you to get called Software Requirement Patterns. This is a good reference. It's not really a textbook, but it's a reference. Now, a requirement pattern provides a systematic approach to specifying a particular type of requirement. The pattern defines a template with categories of information for that kind of requirement. And different types of requirement patterns will have their own sets of content categories. If you use that template and populate it, it'll help you think about how to write better requirements than if somebody just writes it in natural language as we usually do. So I strongly encourage you to have a copy of Withall's Software Requirements Patterns book around. Steve actually reviewed the chapter on reuse that I wrote. That was the hardest thing I ever wrote, was that chapter on reuse, because there was almost nothing about it in the literature. But Stephen was very, very gracious and helpful in reviewing that for us and added a lot of value. So I think you'll find there's a lot of great information in his book. you need to kind of choose the right scope of applicability. Domain-specific requirements are typically written at a low level of abstraction, and they're likely only to be applicable in their original domain. They're real specific. Generic requirements have broader reuse potential. But if you try to reuse requirements at too general a level, you won't save much work because you still need to elaborate the details. So it's kind of tricky to find the right balance between making reuse easier with more general or abstract requirements and making reuse pay off because you've got the details that you don't have to then fill in. I can't tell you a formulaic way to do this. You have to just kind of grope around a little bit to figure out if I'm going to write requirements that I think should be reusable, how much detail do you put into them? I talked to some people at a project once that worked very hard to make their requirements reusable, put a lot of effort into that, but they made them so detailed and so specific to the original project that they weren't generally applicable to other projects, and most of that was wasted effort. So that wasn't the smartest way to do it. But let me tell you about an example of how you could generalize a requirement to increase its reuse potential. Suppose your application includes a user requirement to accept credit card payments. Okay, and that's your original user requirement. Now that would expand into some set of related functional and non-functional requirements all around handling credit card payments. Other applications also might need to take payments by credit card, so that's a potentially reusable set of requirements and tests. But suppose you could generalize that user requirement, so it's not just reusable exactly as it is on a future project, but also you could generalize it to cover several payment mechanisms, maybe credit card, debit card, gift card, electronic checks, electronic funds transfers. There's a lot of ways we do that now. So this resulting requirement would offer greater reuse potential in a wider range of future projects because it gives you more flexibility, more capabilities. One of those projects might just need credit card processing, but others need several of those payment methods. So if you generalize an initial user requirement like this, that could even be usable and valuable to the current project. So even if the customer only asks for handling credit card payments initially, they might really want to accept multiple payment methods either now or in the future. So that's the good news, is that if you generalize it, you've got good reuse potential. The bad news is that it will take some effort to generalize that initially presented requirement. And that's the investment that you make in reusability, anticipating that you're going to recoup that investment and more through multiple future instances of reuse. But this is where you have to be thoughtful, because if you put in all this effort to generalize that initial requirement and then it turns out that none of your future projects ever need anything except for credit card payments, then that was wasted effort. So put some thought into deciding which kinds of requirements have good growth and reuse potential and which ones just really don't need to be enhanced like this. So here's a key point. Although reuse saves your team time and money, making something readily reusable is likely to cost some time and money. So it's like anything else, there's a trade-off. Let me warn you about some of the barriers to requirements reuse. Now, if the requirements on the previous projects weren't documented, you really can't reuse them. And even if you find a good or a relevant requirement, it might not be very good. It might be badly written, incomplete, or not a good fit for your present project. And even if they're documented, the original requirements might not have been kept current as the application evolved over time, so maybe they're obsolete. NIH, we've all heard that phrase, I think, not invented here. People are sometimes reluctant to reuse requirements that come from somewhere else. But also you have to watch out for NAH, not applicable here, which means that, well, yeah, that was fine for them, but we're different. That doesn't apply to us. And a lot of times, not invented here and not applicable here are just kind of resistance that people show to using something else that's already around. It's best to adopt some standard styles for writing requirements that will facilitate good requirements and reusable requirements, such as using the patterns. If the requirements are written at a common level of granularity, it's easier for future BAs to search for candidate requirements they can reuse at the right level of detail. Consistent terminology is also important. And watch out for requirements that have embedded design constraints, like solution specifics in the requirement, because those don't give you much opportunity for reuse in a different environment. It can be hard to find requirements to reuse because people organize their requirements in different ways. So it's best to have, again, document templates that you're using for organizing the knowledge so people can readily find it. If the requirements are tightly coupled to specific products or to specific implementation environments, those are less likely to be reusable. And another barrier you have to be aware of deals with ownership. Maybe you're developing a product for a specific customer. Well, the requirements are probably that customer's proprietary intellectual property. You might not have the legal right to reuse any of those requirements in a different system that you developed for your own company or for other customers. So be sure to respect the intellectual property rights of whoever owns those requirements. Let me suggest some success factors here. Nobody wants to reuse junk. So first of all, we have to have good requirements. Potential reusers need confidence in the quality of the information. And even if a requirement you're reusing isn't perfect, try to make it better when you reuse it so you keep improving your collected requirements knowledge. If you're serious about reuse, you need to establish mechanisms to make it easy to share and leverage existing information. And that means pulling reusable information out of a specific project so that other people can access it and reuse it. You can't reuse something if you can't find it, so try to set up some sort of searchable repository to store the requirements information. It could just be a simple network folder that contains previous requirements documents people can search through, or it might be a collection of requirements stored in a requirements management tool that can be searched across those projects, or a database you set up yourself. So the idea of an enterprise BA to step back from one project and see what knowledge we have that could span multiple projects, that would be the kind of person who might be responsible for setting this up. You need to have links that help you identify logically related requirements to be used together, or dependencies between one requirement and another. If you pull this one in, you've got to pull these others in, or if you pull this one in, you can't do those others because there's a conflict. Use some common terminology. The terminology variations won't prevent you from reusing requirements, but you might have to deal with inconsistencies and take steps to avoid misunderstandings. Glossaries and data dictionaries are good sources of reusable information. And the management should encourage reuse from two perspectives, both contributing high-quality components that have real reuse potential and encouraging project teams to effectively reuse existing artifacts. In a reuse culture, the BAs look at the reusable requirements repository before they create their own requirements. That's a mindset that you have to build into the organization. So here's a few tips for getting started with requirements reuse. If you think this has some potential in your organization, keep these things in mind as starting points. First of all, look at your current project to see if there are ways that you could have simplified the requirements problem by reusing existing knowledge, either from other projects in the organization or other sources of knowledge that would apply to yours. Don't invent things that other people have invented if you can leverage what's already available. So analyze your current project for requirements that are potentially reusable in other projects across your organization, and see if there's some way that you can start this process of pulling those out, generalizing them as appropriate, pulling in packages of associated tests and other things so that it's a nice little set of related material, and then storing it someplace so that somebody on the next project can look there first and see if there's something that will save them time. Think about what information you would want to store with the requirements to make it easy for a BA to find them or to enhance their reusability. And finally, you're going to have to set up some kind of repository to contain these reusable requirements and make it easy for people to access those. So I hope this presentation has given you some ideas about how to make reuse a part of the requirements engineering practices in your organization. I think you're going to find that the individuals, the project teams, and the organizations that practice reuse most effectively are likely to have the highest productivity and build higher quality products. So just as we've learned in daily life that there are many benefits from going green, let's try to go green by reusing more of the requirements on our software projects. So thank you for joining us. I think we have a little bit of time for Q&A here, if Tracy has anything that she might want to share here.
Absolutely, Karl, and thank you so much. What a great presentation today. I'm going to quickly jump into some of the questions. Our first question is, what is the best time to classify requirements as reusable? Is it when they are originally written or when another project comes along with similar requirements?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When should we classify them as reusable? Now, you won't know for sure if they're reusable until you do get to that next project and says, hey, wait a minute, we've done some of this before. Can I avoid having to reinvent it? But I think you want to kind of keep your eyes open on your current project and think about, what am I doing here that has reuse potential? Like I said, you aren't going to know for sure if that materializes until later. But I would start classifying things as reusable at the time you're writing them for project one, and start thinking about, is this something that's a one-off for us, or is it something so trivial that there's no point in bothering to make it reusable, or is this something that other projects could use? I'll give you an example. When I worked at Kodak for many years in Rochester, New York, in the research labs, and we set up reusable components of several kinds because the kinds of applications we were writing for the scientists to use had certain things in common. Even if it's something as simple as help screen mechanisms or structures of certain capabilities that just show up over and over. It doesn't have to be a big complex thing to save someone time. So I would think about it early on, but don't just assume that every requirement on every project is going to be reusable, because you're going to waste a lot of time making something more reusable that'll never pay off.
Karl, thank you. Our next question. Have you seen teams use Gherkin, given, when, then, to not only provide reuse, but to automate the test?
I have not personally done that, but I'm not a good person to ask. I don't go out and work with a lot of teams hands-on like this, so I honestly don't know much about what they do. So I can't really answer the question. That's not something I've personally seen, but it's not something I'm likely to see, and I can't really comment as to how common that is.
Certainly, Karl, we understand. Thank you. Our next question, would you please share if there are any requirements that can be reusable in an e-commerce domain project?
Well, e-commerce domain, I'd say there's massive amounts of requirements that are reusable. It depends on how specific you decide to make them, but in e-commerce, basically everybody's doing sort of the same thing. You have a product. You want to make people aware of your products so that they can search them, so you're going to have some kind of catalogs and displays and search functions and things like that. You want to have shopping carts where people can put things into their cart and maybe have a cart that's persistent from session to session, so they can come back, say, within a week and the items are still there. You're going to want to have multiple mechanisms for them to pay for the products, like we saw, credit card payment, but many other options as well, depending on your environment. Obviously Amazon is the leader in e-commerce, and they have many, many different payment methods available, and you may not have that many for your store. You're going to provide shipping options. You're going to have customer profiles. You're going to have, you might want to have rating mechanisms set up so people can give you stars and comments. So those kinds of things, there's just no need for everybody to have to invent all that. Or if you're going to have multiple stores, then you can do it once the way you want, your best way. Security issues, again, are going to be very important for that. And then you can reuse those capabilities with other stores. So I think e-commerce has probably got one of the best examples of reusable requirements, because everybody's basically trying to do the same kinds of things. Sell products. Let people pay for them. Let them be delivered.
Thanks, Karl. We have time for one more question. The question is it legal to use the requirements in different competitions?
Is it legal to use a requirement in different competitions? I guess I'm not sure what that's asking, but I think that gets down to the question I mentioned late in the talk about intellectual property and who actually owns the requirement.
Yes.
If you've written an application, maybe you're a custom software development shop, and you get a contract from some vendor or some client that says, hey, could you build this application for us? And you do. Well, you have to have a really clear understanding who owns the requirements for that. If they own them, then you probably can't do that without their permission. You can't reuse any of that because it's not your intellectual property. It's in your brain, so there's always that kind of fuzziness. But I think you have to be real careful about understanding intellectual property rights. And one way to do that is to maybe write the contract such that you maybe don't own the requirements, but you can license them from them, or you co-copyright them or something. I've done that sometimes with clients where I created something at their request, but I said, wow, I can use this myself. So I got joint ownership of it or licensing rights to it, and maybe they paid less for the privilege so that they didn't cost them as much, and I got to own some too. So you can probably negotiate good ways to make that work, but I would definitely be careful to make sure you know who owns the intellectual property.
Thank you, Karl. And at that, it is the top of the hour, so we need to close our webinar today. Karl, again, we'd like to thank you for such a great presentation. We'd like to thank all of our attendees today as well for participating in the Modern Analyst webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at the ModernAnalyst.com website within 2 business days. And this concludes today's event. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.